And now for today's program. Aaron David Miller is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and a former State Department Middle East analyst and negotiator in Republican and Democratic administrations. Aaron is a frequent commentator on CNN, MSNBC, NPR, and BBC, and his articles have appeared in the New York Times, The Washington Post, Foreign Policy, and Foreign Affairs. Robert Siegel was the senior host of NPR's award-winning evening news magazine All Things Considered for 30 years. He was awarded the Edward Murrow Lifetime Achievement Award in Journalism and has been honored with 3 silver batons from Alfred I. DuPont Columbia University, as well as the American Bar Association's Silver Gavel Award. Currently, he hosts Navigating the New Abnormal, a series of web seminars sponsored by American Friends of Rabin Medical Center. Robert is a special contributor to Moment Magazine and serves on the advisory board for Moment's Daniel Pearl Investigative Journalism Initiative. Please welcome Aaron David Miller and Robert Siegel.
Aaron, as always, it's good to see you.
You too, and it's great to see Suzanne, and applaud Moment for doing what they do in the public space and behind the scenes.
Here, here. An Israeli-Iranian war per se is not surprising. We've heard people arguing about whether there should be such an attack for decades now. But the timing is surprising. So my first question to you is, why now? And what does the timing tell us about what Israel, and by consequence, for that matter, Iran, would consider a success in this conflict?
Yeah, both questions are still highly speculative. Planning for this probably began, probably several years ago, but in an active way, according to Israeli reports, in the fall of 2024. Soon after the Israeli intelligence and the Israeli Air Force managed to do what few people thought that they could do, which was to literally hollow out Iran's billion-dollar proxy. Hezbollah, by the way, issued a statement on June 13, 14, indicating that they would not initiate any conflict with Israel. They were there and supported for Iran for precisely this purpose, as a hedge and insurance policy should the Israelis ever strike Iran and its nuclear site. So planning probably began there. I would argue that there are several factors. Number one, you have a prime minister, the longest governing prime minister in the history of the state of Israel, who has made it his life's work and mission to free the Israeli public and the state of Israel from the shadow, not only of Islamic extremism, but the shadow of an Iranian bomb. This has been his fixation, his part of his mission in life. I think that's the who. The what, I think, has a lot to do with what the Israelis have managed to achieve over the course of the last 18 months. I'll use a term of art and I'll explain it, which is escalation dominance. The reality is that the state of Israel now, in terms of its relationship with its 3 adversaries, the ones who are 2 who are close, 1 who is roughly 800 miles away. Israel can control the pace, the focus, the intensity of its military activities with Hamas, with Hezbollah, and with Iran, without fear of any of those adversaries escalating in a way that the Israelis cannot deter, and the Israelis decide when, where, and how to escalate. That does not mean Israel is a regional hegemon, the way the Soviet Union was in Eastern Europe, the way the US has been in many respects in the Western Hemisphere. But it has this escalation dominance. So you have Netanyahu, the prime minister, committed. You have escalation dominance. You have the perceived threat of an advancing Iranian nuclear program, which since 2018, since President Trump unilaterally abrogated or withdrew from the Iranian nuclear agreement, the so-called Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, largely at the behest of the Israelis, I might add, which is an intriguing irony here. That's the third factor. And the fourth, and I would argue probably it's hard to know where this one sits, and that is the advent of the Trump administration and a Republican Party whose view of Israel is literally to give the Israelis, with the exception of the MAGA minority and a few libertarians on the Republican side, most Republicans are Israel right or wrong, or Israel can do no wrong. Democratic Party is deeply divided on the question of Israel, and they're marginalized, and frankly, they don't count. Donald Trump owns Washington, and he owns the Republican Party. And I think Mr. Netanyahu's calculation, which proved to be correct, I might add, when informed on Monday last, they had a phone call. Trump, according to the reports, warned Benjamin Netanyahu not to attack Iran until it was absolutely clear that there was no chance for the negotiation. They talked again on Thursday. And at that point, whether Trump greenlit this operation, whether it was a flashing yellow or a blinking green or a sort of faded red, he did not say no. And not only did he not say no, he actively participated in the critical ruse that the Israelis had constructed to use the reports of the Israeli press, to put the Iranians to sleep and convince them that there would be no Israeli strike at a minimum until yesterday's planned meeting in Oman between Stephen Witkoff and the Iranian foreign minister was concluded. That was critically important. That deception, which Trump helped the Israelis orchestrate, was critically important to the decapitation strategy which the Israelis pursued Thursday, Friday night. The Iranians were stunned, unprepared, and frankly, again, an Israeli general, retired, said to me, the Iranians and the Israelis are playing soccer. The only issue is the Iranians don't have a goalie. And it is that mental image that explains so much of what we've watched Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. So I think those four factors basically explain why the Israelis struck when they did.
So they struck when they did. Would it be a sufficiently successful outcome to Prime Minister Netanyahu or other Israelis to reduce damage, greatly set back the Iranian nuclear program, but to use the same metaphor that's invoked elsewhere in the region, view it as an exercise in cutting the grass and mowing the lawn. That is, cutting back the nuclear program, assuming that it would eventually grow back again, and then there would have to be another war with Iran. Would that qualify as a successful mission?
I mean, defining success for the Israelis over the last 18 months is not such an easy thing to do. The Security Cabinet puts out a set of attainable, realistic goals. I don't know the exact language. I was actually going to look it up. They talk about damaging the Iranian nuclear program and dealing with Iran's missiles and their ballistic missiles and their launchers. But Robert, had you told me on October 8th, 2023, that the Israel-Hamas war would have been in its 18th month, despite the objectives that the Security Cabinet laid out, I would have said to you, that's impossible. And I would just I urge myself to keep that in mind. I don't know at this point what, in Gaza, the Prime Minister has defined victory as total victory. That means not just the hollowing out of Hamas as an organized military force, but its eradication as a political influence in Gaza, the de-radicalization of the population, and who knows what else. Here, I mean, I think the Israelis may well have to make a virtue out of necessity, because according to the IAEA estimates, looking at overhead, and we don't know what the battle damage assessments will be. We may never know, because there are undeclared nuclear sites. But the Israelis seem to have damaged, undermined several features and aspects of the nuclear program, but they have by no means, we're starting the fourth, well, Thursday will be a week, Thursday night. They've not destroyed it, eradicated it, or created a situation where it cannot, under better circumstances than these, be reconstituted. But that's not all they're doing, right? They're decapitating the general command of the Iranian military. They're going after IRGC leaders. They're killing nuclear scientists and engineers. They are going after gas depots, both the South Pars gas field and the main gas installation facility in Tehran. An hour or so ago, the CNN Chiron, I got a call to do some commentary. They bombed Iranian state television, and there are pictures of the broadcasters fleeing the building with smoke pouring in. So they are taking advantage to disrupt, to undermine, and to create, I think, forget regime change. I mean, we can talk about that.
Yeah,
A
yeah.
situation where Iranians are going to ask themselves, what is this all about? I mean, $5 trillion for a nuclear program. What have we gotten from this?
Yeah, yeah. But you use the phrase regime change, and I should just add here that ever since the end of World War II, when the U.S. conducted a strategic bombing survey to figure out what the effect had been of heavy bombing of Nazi Germany, they came to the conclusion that in fact bombing tended to stiffen the resolve of the public that was on the receiving end, rather than breaking their will. And after Vietnam, people found similar things in studying the
Right.
impact of air war. Do Israelis seriously think that moment of questioning what has this been worth it? What have the mullahs gotten us for trillions of dollars? That it's somewhere nearby, and that this
I
war
mean,
really.
Israelis, I mean, the people advising the prime minister, um, DMI, the military intelligence of the IDF, the Mossad.
Mhm.
I'm interviewing on Wednesday Seema Shine, who was the former Mossad analyst on Iran, and Ali Vaz. I'm going to ask her this particular question. It's an analytical proposition. Look, in the Arab world, Middle East, when we talk about regime change, so far we've seen two models in the modern period. You've seen
Mhm.
mass demonstrations in the streets of Cairo and Tunis, fruit sellers self-immolating themselves, and the military refusing to fire on the people. That's how Hosni Mubarak left office, and the Muslim Brotherhood eventually took over, and then al-Sisi replaced them. Or that's one model. Or alternatively, you've got Syria, in which a well-organized movement, a former Al-Qaeda affiliate, Hayat Tahrir Sham, HTS, with support by the Turks, but a coherent, cohesive military political organization that had experience in governing in the Idlib province, took advantage of the weakness and hollowness of the Assad regime. And within 2 weeks, they were in Damascus in control.
Mhm.
When I hear Israelis talk about regime change, I ask them the question, are you suggesting that what you are doing is going to create massive uprising, which will overcome the forces of counter-revolution that the Iranian regime is capable of the thousands of Basij, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, and who or what is going to assume responsibility? Do you have contacts with a military cadre, security elites that you're paying, or who are fundamentally opposed to the Islamic Republic and who are going to act as your proxies? So this doesn't compute. That's not to say, Robert, that, you know, who knows how quickly things could change, as we saw in Egypt, but the conditions for that, I
Mhm.
don't see them being set. So I'm
Yeah.
assuming that within the next 2 weeks, the intent, assuming it doesn't escalate and the US does not get involved, we can talk about why that would happen. I'm assuming the next couple of weeks, this is going to find a way to enter a different phase um, without regime change, with the Iranian government still in place, and perhaps with much of, assuming the Americans do not get involved, with much of the nuclear um, program, much of it still intact.
Having launched its attacks against Iran without U.S. participation, the Israelis left open all the questions surrounding the Iranians' underground nuclear uh, site at Fordo, I believe. And I know no Farsi. I don't know if I'm mispronouncing that. This is said to be so deep that the Israelis just don't have the weaponry. They don't have the ordnance to penetrate the earth in order to get at it. But that the United States could do that is what's often
Yes.
said. Has Israel, in effect, started a war, uh, understanding that it can't finish it, that the actual coup de
Sounds
grace
familiar.
against the military program would be done by the United States? Or have they given Donald Trump the leverage, since the U.S. presumably has a weapon that could end Iran's nuclear program, or Israel being deprived of it would force Israel to accept some kind of new Iran nuclear deal? Does that put Trump in the in a position where he actually can force talks?
Um, it's a hard question to answer. I mean, in my view, even with bunker busters,
Hmm.
the massive ordnance penetrators and the B-2 Spirit bombers, which are deployed at Diego Garcia, and there, by the way, there are reports of long-range aerial refueling tankers that are being shipped to the Middle East. Now, that's an intriguing sort of contingency. What are they going to be used for? They're usually used for long distance strikes, which the Israelis can do, but they can't do with the kind of redundancy that the US could. I don't think Donald Trump wants to get into this. I think you're in a situation in which there are a couple different pathways that could involve the United States. But even if the United States got involved, and even if the bunker busters were used against Fordo, I think the only way to solve the Iranian nuclear problem is to you need a new government. You
Hmm.
need a regime that is not acquisitive. You need a regime that is not interested or doesn't need to be a screwdriver's turn away from a nuclear weapon. And once scientific knowledge enters the collective head of a community, how do you extract it?
Hmm.
Could these activities actually incentivize Iran to try to break out for a weapon? I mean, it's certainly a possibility. So I think that as long as the Iranians do not strike U.S. assets, U.S. forces on Iraqi bases in Iraq, U.S. forces in Syria or the Gulf, and as long as these ballistic missiles that are launched at Israel do not create a mass casualty event. And remember, since October 7th, you have not seen anything like the pictures that you are seeing in Tel Aviv
Hmm.
and in
Hmm.
Haifa. There are 10 sites that have been described as mass destruction. That was not true in '06 when you had a 30-day campaign in which from northern Israel to the border was not secure as a consequence of Hezbollah's missiles. It wasn't true in '91 with Saddam's Scuds. You
Hmm.
have 24 Israelis killed, several hundred wounded. I mean, I think the Israeli public, I've talked to more than a few people who've been in and out of bunkers. They seem prepared to weather this.
Hmm.
And I think that calculation on the part of the government was probably correct. So I mean, you're asking me how this ends and what is an Israeli definition of victory.
Hmm.
And I think frankly, it's too fluid right now to, to make a judgment, So I'm not going to make predictions. As the Brits say, Robert, we're in early days.
We know it is. What do you think is the perceived interest of the Sunni Arab states? What do you think they're hoping happens or doesn't happen in this war between
I
Israel
think
and
I
Egypt
think their
and
calculations
Iran?
I think their calculations have changed, particularly the Saudis and the Emiratis over the course of the last 20 years. I think at one point Saudi Arabia might have uh, been willing to be the sort of the tip of the American spear with respect to Iran.
Hmm.
But since the Chinese brokered reconciliation several years ago, since the rise of Mohammed bin Salman, aka MBS, and his determination to turn Saudi Arabia into one of the top 20 influential powers in the world, stability, economic investment, the absence of conflict in the Gulf, and what I would call a 360-degree foreign policy in which MBS wants to be friends with everybody. The Russians and the Chinese, whom he admires because they don't have political systems that ask questions. There's no dissent. There's no parlor. There's no free press. MBS likes that,
Hmm.
and with Iran as well. I would I would call that this a détente, a relaxation of tensions. I think the Saudis are under no illusions about the nature of the Islamic Republic. I guess secretly, I mean, would they be egging the Israelis on if it meant that eventually this would turn into a US involved conflict in which geography is destiny? That is the one cardinal rule of the Middle East, which should be enshrined and impacted on everybody's analysis. It is geography that determines and shapes what a country's interests are. And the Gulfies are vulnerable in the extreme. Iran has thousands of short-range ballistic missiles. They've already proven in 2019 they could disrupt Saudi oil producing facilities with a handful of drones and maybe cruise missiles. So geography is destiny. I think the Saudis and the Emiratis, who have a better relationship with the Iranians, are calculating this, wondering uh, what Israel's objectives really are.
Yeah. Um, I'm curious, have you been surprised by the accounts of how many uh, targeted attacks within Iran have been carried out by the Mossad or people in some way directed by Mossad? The ability to hit particular apartments in apartment
No,
buildings.
it's beyond extraordinary, and you'd have to wonder. Um, I mean, against the trauma, the horrors, the the indiscriminate killing of men, women, and children, the sexual predation, the mutilation, the taking of hostages. When you put October 7, in which the Israelis were literally kilometers away from their adversary, and you stack that up against the intelligence failure,
Hmm.
which was of a galactic nature, not just the intelligence failure, the operational failure. Why weren't forces sufficiently deployed in time
Hmm.
to those Gaza envelope communities? I mean, I was in Israel on October 6, 1973.
Hmm.
Until now, that was the greatest intelligence failure in the history of the state of Israel. This was a far more egregious failure. But you stack that up against the operation against Hezbollah, and then the penetration of a country 800 miles away, 1,200 kilometers away, and you wonder why.
Hmm.
How could they have missed October 7 and gotten Iran and Hezbollah so unbelievably right?
Hmm.
It is something that a state commission of inquiry, which may never be convened
Hmm.
for any number of reasons, would have to address. But yeah, I mean, how could you not be impressed by this?
Yeah. Aaron, earlier you talked about the U.S. role prior to these the attack on Iran. The U.S. as having been part of the ruse that lulled the Iranians to to not be ready for the Israeli attack. Shortly before that, you had been perhaps taken in by the ruse, but you wrote about how the Trump administration was unusual in its lack of concern for Israeli objections to U.S. policy in the Middle East. That is, one example where the U.S. The attempt to get U.S.-Iran talks moving towards some kind of new nuclear agreement.
Yeah.
And the other one was the deal with the Houthis, which the U.S. struck, which didn't even involve the Israelis or protect them. I mean, to you, that it added up to a Trump White House that did not want to be told by the Israelis, here's what you have to do for us. Uh, Now they seem a little bit closer than that.
Well, the point in that article basically was to say that no Republican or Democratic president I ever worked for ever did the things that Donald Trump has done in and around Israel over the last 6 weeks. Directly authorizing his hostage negotiator in March to carry out 3 meetings with Hamas,
Yeah.
freeing Adnan Alexander through a Palestinian cutout, American cutout, Bashar al-Bahba, over the objections of the Israelis, cutting a deal with the Houthis, which the Israelis learned about only after the fact,
Hmm.
and announcing in the company of the prime minister negotiations with Iran and removing sanctions from the Shah regime in Syria, which Netanyahu asked him not to do. No Republican or Democratic president that I ever worked for ever behaved that way. But what this shows, Robert, I think, is the situational, transactional, sort of confused set of responses and options
Hmm.
that this president undertakes. I mean, he is now presiding over 3 cratered negotiations, which he claimed he would resolve quickly: Russia, Ukraine, Israel, Hamas, and the US and Iran. He was responsible for all 3. And yet, because there is no strategy, there is no effective deployment of American leverage, no application of enough vinegar and honey, because you need both to get things done. It suggests to me a president who doesn't have a whole lot of focus and who is situationally drawn to this situation or another with no overarching, and you see it in the rhetoric in response to what the Israelis have done. There's going to be peace. We're talking to everybody. The Iranians better watch out. Sometimes you have to just let them fight it out. He's used the exact same language. I will give him this in terms of his consistency.
Hmm.
Exact same leverage expression about let them fight it out.
Yeah, as you did with the Russians and Ukrainians, yes.
Israel, Hamas, and now with the Israelis and the Iranians. So what can I say? I don't know what to make of any of this. It's not normal. It's not. None of the Republican, Democratic Secretary of State presidents I ever worked for ever behaved like this. And you know something? The results so far seem to reflect uh, that kind of confusion and lack of focus.
At the same time, the degree of shaping a mission, that is Israel shaping a mission to achieve something with respect to Iran's nuclear program, doesn't appear to be the most intricately thought out policy either. It seems to be a reaction to a moment where Iran is especially weak, Israel is especially strong relative to everyone else. But whether this is going to eliminate the Iranian nuclear program or set it back by a few years uh, seems to be unclear on that end.
I mean, I think that you broke the code. I think that escalation dominance is is useful if in fact it can be tethered to a set of attainable and realistic objectives that essentially make what is temporary relatively permanent.
Hmm.
I played this thought experiment in my head a million times since October 7th. I put Rabin in power on October 7th. I put Ben Gurion in power on October 7th. I put Ehud Barak in power on October 7th. And my conclusion is that the response in the face of what happened on October 7th and what is still happening to hostages, the response by these 3 former prime ministers would have been more or less the same The difference is 6 to 8 months into this conflict, these three prime ministers would have begun to understand that military power is a means to an end, and you needed to begin to craft relationships and move the pieces around in a way that you could extricate yourself so that the state of Israel wasn't trapped in a forever war, which will be costly. How Gaza is going to unwind, I mean, whatever happened to Gaza? Who's talking anymore about the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation and the fact that every day
Mhm.
the IDF is operating and the toll of deaths and injuries on the part of the Palestinian civilian population is significant.
Yeah,
And
continues.
that's not going to change. Gaza is not going to have a happy ending, let alone a Hollywood ending. And I worry, again, I'm not an Israeli. I had two Israeli prime ministers, Netanyahu and Rabin, say almost the exact same thing to me in different times. You live, and with this language, you live in Chevy Chase, Maryland. We are sitting on top of a volcano. Don't preach to us about our security. I mean, I'm an American. I'm living thousands of miles away from that
Mhm.
volcano. I'm not going to trivialize the threats that the Israelis face.
Yeah.
But as an analyst, I look at this and I say, well, what's the end state? What's the end game? And it's more than I'll offer an editorial comment. I'm an American, and I've worked on the U.S.-Israel relationship for almost 30 years. I value that relationship
Mhm.
immensely.
Mhm.
I think it is under tremendous stress now because the three elements that constitute what is an American ally. Saudi Arabia is not an ally. The word is used. Saudi Arabia is not an ally. An ally
Mhm.
of the United States is a country in which there's a high degree of coincidence of interests. There is value affinity. Generally, these countries are democratic polities with free presses, and there's a strong and sustainable base of domestic support. I would argue to you that now all those elements are under stress. It doesn't mean that to use my term, that we're on the cusp of what I call the cosmic oive, the sort of collapse of
Mhm.
the U.S.-Israel relationship. No, we're not there.
Yeah.
But I watch the younger generation. I watch the upcoming American politicians. You've had three Democratic senators, the three Chris's, Coons, Murphy, and Van Hollen. I admire and like them and talk to them, to all of them. Say within a year period that the U.S. should condition or restrict U.S. military assistance to Israel. During the Democratic primaries in 2016, you had three or four relatively mainstream politicians, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Beto O'Rourke, used the word racist in, in close proximity in a sentence to the current prime minister of Israel. These
Mhm.
are things that would never have happened.
Yeah. Uh,
At any rate, off the point here. But how the Israelis play this, how they handle Gaza, is going to impact the relationship going forward.
just wanted to run one observation past you and tell me what you think of it. It seems to me that the Israeli activities on the ground in Iran and the picking out targets of leading scientists and senior military officers, and as well as before that the exploding pagers that everybody in Hezbollah had, and to me, this all seems to illustrate how seriously the Israelis have taken the challenge on their northern front and Iran, where the Iranian surrogate was Hezbollah, and how smug they had become about the Palestinians. That in fact the Israelis do regard Iran as an existential threat
And they
to Israel.
should.
which they should, and much more intelligence and shrewd planning and seems to go into that into that relationship than ever went into Gaza in recent years. I don't know what
Yeah.
you think
Well,
about.
yeah, I mean, there's no doubt about that, but it partly because I mean, we don't have to review the whole history of um, negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians and the great frustration, who did what to whom, the Second Intifada, Arafat walking away from this, Abbas not accepting what Omer put on the table. I mean, we can rehearse the whole thing. It all comes down to, I think, leadership.
Hmm.
I mean, Rabin had a choice in the summer of 1993. Um, I was in the middle of that. He was presiding over Shimon Peres's running of the Oslo Tract at the same time which Secretary Christopher was bringing some intriguing proposals from the late Hafez Assad back to Jerusalem. And Rabin chose the Palestinian track instead of Syria. I think he would have rather chosen Syria
Hmm.
because for Israeli politicians, the Palestinian issue confronts all kinds of excruciatingly painful choices. What I find extraordinary that had you told me 6 months into October 7 that the Palestinian issue would be basically marginalized,
Hmm.
which is essentially what's happening now, I wouldn't have believed it. I mean, you had the entire international community, you had American campuses um, demonstrating in a way. I remember the University of Michigan in the late 60s, early 70s, a lot of demonstrations. We haven't seen demonstrations on
Hmm.
American college. We occupied Iran, Afghanistan and Iraq for 20 years.
Hmm.
We killed a lot of innocent Afghans and
Hmm.
Iraqis. We were accused of genocide. Zero.
Hmm.
So, and the entire world was seized with the Palestinian issue, and Israel was going to become a pariah nation. And this was now the moment. And yet, the moment, and the Arabs stood by, Israel's treaty partners and the Gulf states, and watched the Israelis engage in a prosecution of a war against an enemy, admittedly, that willfully co-locates its assets in and above and around and below civilian populations in order to provoke and to blacken Israel's name. But the Israelis enlarged the acceptable number of Palestinian deaths and wounded in prosecuting this war. So you've
Hmm.
got scores of thousands of Palestinians killed. You have the International Court of Justice debating genocide. You have the ICC imposing arrest warrants on the Prime Minister of Israel. And yet, 18 months later, it's all disappeared. What remains is what remains is what Baron Benvenisti, the former mayor of Jerusalem, deputy mayor of Jerusalem,
Hmm.
said in the late 80s. He said, it's a shepherd's war, Aaron. It's a shepherd's war between, and you know something, Robert? The world doesn't care about this.
Hmm.
The
Hmm.
Arabs don't care about it. They did nothing. They imposed not a single cost on Israel or the United States as they watched the Israelis prosecute this war in Gaza. They stood by.
Hmm.
So if the Arabs don't care, the international community is feckless. Donald Trump doesn't care. I mean, that is to me the central question.
Yeah.
Who does care?
Who cares?
Sorry to drone on, but
You know,
you got me started on this one, Robert.
I just wanted to tell people who you mentioned the days when Yitzhak Rabin had a choice. There was this Oslo process that Peres was indirectly. I mean, he and Peres had actually made a political marriage
Right.
after years of intra-party bickering. And Itamar Rabinovich, the former Israeli ambassador to Washington, described this in a book that I found it remarkable. that the Israelis wanted to get the head of Syria, the president of Syria, Hafez al-Assad, to commit to some Sadat-like gesture, to do something along the lines of Anwar Sadat coming to Jerusalem,
Yep.
and and Assad wanted none of it. He wanted the deal up front.
Cold peace.
And Rabin, they had Warren Christopher, the U.S. Secretary of State, putting a hypothetical to Hafez al-Assad. What if the Israelis did
Right.
this? Could you imagine you doing this? And he sent back some curt response saying, enough of this business. Either you're making a deal or you're not making a deal. And Rabin to this says, okay, go with this Palestinian thing
This is
instead.
exactly what
Go,
happened, Robert.
go with this. Go with this other thing. It would have been more than the traffic could bear, more than the political traffic could bear in Israel to go with both,
Right.
and not enough for American satisfaction to go with only with none. And so we got the Oslo process. Um, how just in terms of the numbers of rockets, the numbers of missiles that Iran supposedly has, how long can this go on?
Good
How
question. I mean, they've launched, according to the Israelis, 350 missiles since June 13th. Roughly 5 to 10% of those have made impact. There are a lot of missiles that got through. The Israelis don't count because they track them to open areas.
Mhm.
But since the Iranians are expressly, willfully targeting urban areas, particularly Tel Aviv and Haifa,
Mhm.
there are at least 10, I think I referred to this, 10 sites where you had serious destruction. It's in those sites that the casualties have occurred. So I think that the Iranians estimated to have anywhere from 2,000 to 2,500. They've launched 350. But the Israelis have eliminated, and this is the interesting part, reportedly a third of the launchers. And no matter how many missiles you have, if you
Mhm.
if you don't have the means to launch them, you don't have the missiles, basically. So I think this could last a good while longer, 10 days, 2 weeks. I can't imagine it would last beyond that in terms of each side's capacity to continue to operate. Um, with no escalation.
Mhm.
The question is, at what point does it become and the term of art is a hurting stalemate
Mhm.
for one side or the other? A stalemate for sure, but a hurting stalemate. Now, just reading the press before I got on, there are a lot of traces of Iran's requests to try to draw Trump into a negotiation. It may well be that we are overestimating or overestimating Iran's capacity and willingness to endure this. And I think we should consider that as a possible option. Then the question becomes, the Israelis want to really cripple the nuclear program. How do they rationalize an ending in
Mhm.
which you get a cessation of hostilities and most of the program is still intact? And the US is now negotiating, because Trump is absolutely willing to do this, to sit down where they left off and try to figure out some way to make the Iranians an offer, which they've already rejected. I mean, that was predictable.
Mhm.
But I could imagine the Israeli-Iranian relationship, if it doesn't escalate, devolving into a more bitter version of where it's been. You don't have these missiles going back and forth. You've got Israelis using proxies to kill Iranian scientists. You've got Iranians using their proxies to try to take out Israelis. You've got terror attacks against Israeli embassies and diplomatic establishments abroad. And the Iranians have also targeted, as we know, in Buenos Aires in 94, 85 Jews were killed when they bombed the cultural center there. And
Yeah.
there was a report that Ahmed Vahidi, who Interpol issued a red notice for, who was implicated in that attack, has been deemed a new commander of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. Someone sent me an email last night that said that's not true, but that's one to watch as well. So that it could end up to be just a continuation of this grim slog between these two countries. But again, it's early days, and another Brit expression, we're a long way from Tipperary, Robert, in terms of.
Yeah, as I should say so. Well, Aaron, as we've been talking, our listeners have been submitting questions to Suzanne Borden. So I'd like Suzanne to rejoin us and put to you, I assume they're all to you, the questions that people have. Hi, Suzanne.
Right, and I'm going to promise three-line answers if I can control myself, which is hard. You drop a nickel in me, and I just keep going.
No.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that conversation. Very complicated issue. The thing that keeps coming up are the hostages. How does this war with Iran impact negotiations to get the hostages back?
Right, 55 left, roughly anywhere from 20 to 23, the Israelis estimate, are still alive. Again, it's impossible. Hamas now has a new leader. That's the third in 18 months. Who's making decisions based on what? I think they understand the hostages are their last remaining leverage. They will not concede this unless the Israelis agree to withdraw forces from Gaza and end the war. This government will absolutely not do that. And that's why I see the possibility of another incremental trade if Hamas feels that Iran is under so much pressure that they can't expect any additional support. It's conceivable the Hamas will agree to what Witkoff put on the table, which is 10 out of the 20 plus on day one, and half the bodies of those who have not survived. And then negotiations on the future of ending the war and withdrawing Israeli forces, which would be open-ended without resolution.
Thank you. In terms of Netanyahu and being in power still, does this war have, how do the people of Israel feel about this? And does this continue does his power surge? Does his rating surge? Or is this going to maybe be the piece that gets him out of power?
Well, July 27th, the Knesset goes into summer recess. I think it reconvenes right probably after the Jewish holidays. The thing is, Netanyahu's already got that much time. Knesset will go out of session unless there is some abominable turn, and this whole campaign that the Israelis have initiated somehow goes south in ways we can't anticipate. This is going to give him a huge boost. It's deferred the issue of the ultra-Orthodox conscription. It has marginalized and put on hold any kind of negotiation in Gaza, which might threaten his right-wing coalition because Smotrich and Ben-Gvir will stay as long as Netanyahu does not end the war in Gaza and agree to some asymmetrical number of Palestinian prisoners. So no, I think on balance, there's absolutely no doubt, unless there's truly some factor, some vector that'll just sail in that we can't see, that he'll remain in power. Elections conceivable by the end of the year or early next. So that would basically mean this government, which was set up in December of 2022, will go to term. The average length of an Israeli government since independence is 1.8 years. That doesn't mean elections every 1.8 years, because sometimes those governments are reconstituted in place. It's government, in amazing fashion, after judicial reform, the failure of October 7th is going to go to term, which is, to me, just extraordinary.
Could you address how Israeli airplanes can physically get to Iran without overflying Sunni Arab countries? Is there some implied or express agreement by those countries to allow Israel to overfly, or are they fearful of confronting the invasion of their airspace?
The Jordanians allowed the Israelis through in April and October of last year. They shot down Iranian drones. The Gulf states have cooperated. unnamed Gulf states have cooperated in providing intelligence under CENTCOM's direction. They have a whole air defense system, which involves unidentified, unnamed Gulf states. Iraq, I mean, so you're in Baghdad or you're in Damascus, and the Israelis are overflowing. What are you going to do? You got 2,500 Americans in Iraq. The Israelis not only own Iranian airspace, but they've proven that they can also, by accommodation and also simply by blunt force, create pathways over Arab countries without fear of engagement.
What stops Russia or North Korea from giving Iran a nuclear warhead in order to disrupt the Middle East?
Technology. The North Koreans already played a role in providing critically important advice and equipment to the Syrian reactor, which the Israelis blew up in 2007. I mean, the Russians are not in the business of transferring nuclear weapons to, even though their relationship with the Iranians are close. The last thing Putin wants to see, or she for that matter, Kim Jong-un, I can't speak for, is a nuclearization of this region. You have one. How many nuclear powers you got? You got Russia, you got China, you got Pakistan, you got India, you got France, Britain, the U.S., and Israel. You got eight countries that have deliverable nuclear weapons. So North Korea. I may have counted someone twice. That's a remarkable accomplishment since the last time a nuclear weapon was deployed against humans on this planet. It's a remarkable accomplishment that you have so few countries during the course of the last 70, well, since the end of World War II, who have deliverable nuclear weapons. Neither the Chinese nor the Russians have any interest in providing the Iranians with air defense systems. Maybe the Russians already provided them. The Israelis have destroyed them. The Chinese are rebuilding Iran's ballistic missile inventory and capacity. But on the nuke side, no, I don't see that.
And any impact or effect on the Russian-Ukrainian war?
It's at a stalemate. The lines, which are 600 miles long, will probably hold with respect to the Ukrainians. They're going to face a problem probably in 2026. The Europeans, we'll see what the Trump administration does. They'll continue to provide intelligence. Right now, there are no arms deliveries to Ukraine authorized. They're still living off the remnants of the last authorizations, deliveries from Biden. Maybe the Trump administration will let the Europeans buy American equipment, and European weapons manufacturers are ramping up. Ukraine will probably be okay. I don't think this, unless it goes off in some direction I can't anticipate, will have much of an impact on moving the front lines or Russia or Zelensky's calculations one way or another on the war.
Suzanne, may I just ask Aaron about something? I mean, one thing that the war in Ukraine and this war have in common is the role of drones.
Right.
And I'm just wondering whether one serves as a model to the other, whether they've been rethinking what war is all about.
Yeah, absolutely, that's the case. And the Iranians, in the early phases of the war, provided the Russians with valuable technology as well as these Shahed drones. But the Russians have now, that's the one thing, sanctions, the Russians have managed to cope, more than cope with this. Putin is determined to see this through. And Trump, frankly, wants to end the fighting, but not the war, which is it's not a entirely happy situation for Putin, but he'd take it if it meant normalizing his relationship with Trump, which is exactly what Trump wants.
Yeah.
The Russians have modified these Shahed drones. They're much more deadly now. And and being launched in large numbers, as we know, against Ukraine.
Iran's sophisticated multiple satellite systems may have contributed to the ease of Hamas's coordinated attack on October 7th, as well as Iran's current cruise drone and ballistic missile attacks. Why does Israel appear reticent to neutralizing this threat from Iran? Doing such might send a crystal clear message to Iran and its IRGC that more of such may be in the offering, should they continue striking non-military targets.
I mean, the Israelis have moved well beyond striking. I mean, they are striking non-military targets, right? The Israelis are. I have no information on uh, Iranian communications, sophisticated satellite stuff with respect to October 7th. The reality about October 7th, I think, is clear to any intelligence analyst. Hamas went dark, and the Israelis believe somehow that their technical capacities could somehow anticipate the October 7th attack. I don't think the Iranians knew the date of this attack. I think Hamas kept them in the dark. Hamas went dark in terms of using their own communications. Only when Israeli intel picked up the activation of SIM cards, which are used in mobile phones, SIM cards that could be used in Israel. And again, if there were a state commission inquiry, a lot of this stuff is going to come out. So if the Israelis had a fundamental problem with satellite technology that the Iranians were using, they would have figured out a way, or we would have figured out a way to take it out. I'm not familiar with that. Forgive me.
Okay. I'm going to try and real quick, two more questions, and then we've got to wrap up here. If you have to put in numerical percentages, what is the probability that this war will expand into a regional war?
I really don't do that. Look, the longer it goes on, how about this? The longer it goes on, the more likely the possibility of an American involvement. Whether or not some pro-Iranian group launches an attack against a U.S. troop deployment in Iraq or Syria, whether the Iranians attack an Israeli embassy or Jewish interests abroad, or there's a mass casualty event in Israel which forces Trump's hand. The longer this goes on, the greater the chance of an escalation. That's about all. I mean, putting percentages on it. I mean, I've been wrong. I was wrong about October 7th. I was wrong about what the Israelis were going to do with Hezbollah. I become quite careful these days.
And lastly, are there any leaders out there that you think, Palestinians, Israelis, Iranians, Arab states, United States, that have the political competence to forge a sustainable peace?
Right.
Is anybody waiting in the wings?
This is, of course, is the core question. Marx, not Groucho, the other one, wrote in the 19th century and he was writing in the 19th century, so forgive me. Suzanne, forgive me. Marx wrote that men make history, but rarely as they please. The importance of leadership in this region is so important. When anything of value occurred, anything, it was because you had leaders who were masters of their politics, not prisoners of their ideologies, leaders who are willing to risk. And we don't have those leaders. We don't have them in Israel. The struggle for leadership in Palestine and among Palestinians in the wake of October 7th is, if it wasn't so important, it would be a fascinating thing to observe. Abbas or Hamas? I mean, and no way to choose, because there won't be elections, because the Palestinian polity, or what remains of it, is been so hollowed out. And Gaza? No, you need leaders. Without leaders, you can manage, maybe. You can't resolve.
And any lasting thoughts? Any glimmer of hope?
Glimmer of hope. No, off screen, I said to Robert that the truth is my thoughts these days, as fascinated as I am by this, and as much as I have to do in writing and analyzing about this, that, and the other, what really concerns me is the challenge here at home. America's been through all kinds of traumas, but we've never quite been here before. I was trying to convince a millennial the other day that 1968 was the worst year, a much worse year than any of the Trump years, any of them. Thousands of Americans were dying in Vietnam. Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King were murdered. You had a level of violence in cities that goes well beyond anything we've experienced. You had Chicago and the convention, but we've never quite been here before. And here is as acute an aggrandizement of presidential power as we've ever had in this country before. We have a president who is incapable of turning the M in me upside down so it becomes a W in we, untethered from any broader sense of objective. And it's all being done with an unkindness and a cruelty that is horrifying to me. It's an assault against law firms, against the universities, against science, against cultural institutions in Washington. On a personal note, I know Lindsay and I have been here for almost 50 years. Everything that I believed in, everything I've worked for and around, public service, selflessness, the notion that people should think in terms of broader than their own personal interests, and America, right? All of that just seems to me to be completely up in the air now. And what's being broken will not be repaired easily. So I'll end on an optimistic note. Jack Kennedy, the last president that had influence on me, I was 12 when he was murdered, described himself as an idealist without illusion. I think that's where we need to be. Never give up on the prospects that things can change for the better. They really can. Hope isn't enough. It's got to be tethered to action. But as you go through the process of trying to change, you've got to go through the process with your eyes wide open because the costs of not seeing what's happening have become prohibitive. Again, thank you, Robert Siegel. I would come on just to hear your voice for 45 minutes. My daughter refuses to erase the phone message that you left her and the reading you did for her book.
Yes.
And I mean, they're going to put it on a moonshot probably and send it out into outer space. An extraordinary voice, and I love being with you.
Well, it's always good to see you, Aaron. I enjoy these.
Well,
Even though the material, what we end up talking about is
It's
usually
uplifting.
terribly depressing. Yeah, I
Expressing
always enjoy
myself
talking.
yet again.
well, thank you, Aaron. Thank you, Robert. We want to thank the audience for joining us. Please go to momentmag.com to find out more and read more articles. And we will see everybody next time. Thank you.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Bye
Bye-bye.
bye.
Take
Take
care.
good care.